The desert exhaled heat as lines stitched the earth into vast emblems the wind could not erase. And the narrator observed how Elena Ward paced the ridge with a notebook gripped like a compass to memory. Elena Ward said, "Patterns always speak when we quiet down enough to listen." The plane's roar faded, leaving a hush that made the mesa feel suspended above time. The sand glittered like powdered glass while vultures traced circles that mirrored the geoglyphs below. Sofia Rios kept her distance, and the narrator noted how caution softened her steps, but never dimmed her curiosity. Sofia Rios said, "Tourists see drawings, but caretakers see warnings." Elena Ward knelt by a marker flag and brushed dust from a shard that was not ceramic yet not modern. The shard gleamed in a harsh angle of light, and the narrator felt the desert press closer. Elena Ward said, "If intention leaves a residue, these lines are saturated." A radio crackled with a clipped voice that withheld a name. "Wow." The narrator marked the air tighten as if a curtain fell. Night fell with a crisp clarity that etched constellations like fresh ink, and the narrator followed Elena Ward as she sketched overlays that mapped stars to lines with a practiced calm that disguised urgency. Elena Ward said, "If the sky repeats the earth, the message might be cyclical." The camp lantern hummed, and moths battered at its glow like anxious punctuation. Sofia Rios studied the ledger of flight permits and narrowed her focus where dates misaligned. Sofia Rios said, "Someone keeps knowing where you plan to look next." The silence after her words thinned, and the narrator sensed a boundary had been crossed. A distant truck downshifted on a gravel road and then stopped too soon. Elena Ward said, "Truth resists darkness by pattern, not by noise." She laid transparent film across a satellite print, and the lines aligned in a way that felt chosen. The radio remained mute, and the narrator noted how the mute held power. The wind rose, and then remembered to lie low. Dawn lifted without ceremony, and the narrator watched Elena Ward measure a segment that refused to resolve as straight when sighted from ground level. Elena Ward said, "These lines are truer from heights, which means intention considered altitude." Sofia Rios radioed the airstrip and was answered by a courteous delay that felt rehearsed. Sofia Rios said, "They are stalling, and they want us to accept it as routine." The map rustled like a restless animal, while a thin cloud spread into gauze across the sun. The narrator mocked how the land seemed to tilt toward the horizon, where the geoglyphs pooled like thought made visible. A white SUV idled beyond the fence, and dust sifted under it in patient streams. Elena Ward said, "We proceed on foot and verify the trapezoid vertices by pace and mark." She capped her pen as if sealing a vow. The SUV eased back, and the narrator recognized a watcher who knew when to be absent. The air tasted of iron and faint rain that never arrived. By noon, heat drummed through the soil, and the narrator kept pace as Elena Ward logged vertex bearings, while Sofia Rios photographed cross-tracks that should not exist. Elena Ward said, "Interference is recent, the compaction is shallow." Sofia Rios said, "Recent, and permitted by someone with a key." The wind paused in the spaces between their words, and the desert listened. A glint rose from the slope where a fragment of polished stone caught the sun and returned it in a clean blade. The narrator felt the day narrow to that single flash. Elena Ward said, "Signal mirrors or ceremonial facets. Either way, it is deliberate." A condor shadow passed and the ground cooled for a breath that lingered too long. Footprints crossed and doubled back as if the walker rehearsed a route. The radio hissed and then carried a clipped message that ended on a name that refused to arrive. Elena Ward said, "Record everything. Omission is the first ally of secrecy." The day leaned toward evening when a voice reached them from the ridge, and the narrator turned with Elena Ward to see a figure outlined against a thinning sky. The stranger spoke without introduction and carried calm like a pass. Ishan Kadir said, "Lines are not doors, they are locks, and locks require careful hands." Elena Ward answered with patience that had an edge. Elena Ward said, "Locks imply keys, and keys imply holders. The ridge wind trimmed their words to essentials as Sofia Rios circled to flank the talk. Sofia Rios said, "If you have a key, you can show it or you can leave." The stranger stepped closer and placed a folded transparency on the table, then stepped back as if proximity were a claim he did not want. Ishan Kadir said, "You will need altitude before the new moon, and someone has planned for that." The narrator felt the plane gather quiet in one place. Elena Ward said, "We will make our own altitude." Morning broke over the Panamericana as freight dust braided the horizon, and the narrator watched Elena Ward trace routes on a creased atlas. Elena Ward said, "We move south along the Pampas and chart anomalies as we go." Sofia Rios scanned the flight logs and matched them to fuel slips that did not add up. Sofia Rios said, "Someone is ghosting refuels under a project name that shifts weekly." A roadside shrine flickered with candles that refused to gutter, and the air smelled of copper. Ishan Kadir rode silent until a curve exposed a distant ridge with fresh gouges. Ishan Kadir said those scars are new, and not from locals. The narrator noted how the road hummed like a held breath. Elena Ward said, "If they rushed, they left edges we can read." A hawk kited the wind, and then locked still as if eavesdropping. Sofia Rios said, "We log, we do not engage." The pickup climbed, and the plateau lifted to meet them like an appointment kept. They reached a fenced cut where tire tracks forked into the scrub, and the narrator felt the land bristle at intrusion. Elena Ward said, "They dragged something heavy across the crust." Sofia Rios photographed tread width and counted lugs with neat precision. Sofia Rios said, "Industrial, not local pickups." A laminated badge lay half buried, its logo sanded to a ghost. Ishan Kadir said, "Front company rotated monthly, same owner behind them." The wind lifted grains like needles that skittered and sang against the fence. Elena Ward said, "We triangulate the pull direction and find the origin." A truck engine coughed from beyond a low berm and then cut. The narrator mocked how silence arrived as a decision. Sofia Rios said, "We leave no prints near the cut." Elena Ward nodded once and set flags as if stitching a wound closed. By afternoon they reached Cahuachi's adobe mounds, and the narrator felt the past rise like heat through clay. Elena Ward said ritual geography meets engineered sightlines here. A curator approached with measured calm that hid concern. Daniel Cross said, "Access requires coordination, yet your permits arrive oddly fast." Sofia Rios glanced at Ishan, and a silence cracked enough to show doubt. Sofia Rios said, "We share findings if we can protect them." The curator's smile held, but his eyes calculated risk. Daniel Cross said, "Protection has sponsors, and sponsors collect." Elena Ward studied lintels, where shadows formed triangles at precise hours. Elena Ward said, "Time is a tool, not a witness." The narrator sensed that help had arrived wearing masks. The wind carried a reed flute from the river, and caution set like plaster. At the regional archive, ceiling fans chopped the heat into patient beats, and the narrator watched boxes arrive with redacted forms. Elena Ward said, "They censored bearings, not dates, which is a tell." Sofia Rios overlaid flight plans onto archaeologic surveys and found corridors that met at a hummingbird's beak. Sofia Rios said, "They aim for symbolic junctions." Ishan Kadir checked donor ledgers and underlined a shell company with a scholar's name. Ishan Kadir said Marcus Vale funds both access and denial. The name hung like static in dry air. Elena Ward said, "We draft questions that need answers but not permission." Paper edges lifted as a draft slipped through the shutters, and a file clipped itself shut as if shy. The narrator noted how truth gathered weight with each alignment. A guard paused at the door and decided against entering. Dusk draped the motel courtyard, and the narrator caught the neon sign stutter like a heartbeat. Elena Ward said, "Marcus Vale collects keys by owning the doors." Sofia Rios spread prints that mapped lines to sponsor sites with the patience of a chess endgame. Sofia Rios said, he anticipates altitude on the new moon, just as Ishan warned. A silhouette paused at the rail and vanished when the stair creaked. Ishan Kadir said, we send a decoy plan and move 2 hours early. The pool light jittered, and moths wrote frantic cursive on its surface. Elena Ward said, we hold to evidence, not provocations. A text arrived from an unknown number with a photo of their table inside the room. The narrator felt the night lean in to listen. Sofia Rios said, we relocate now, and we leave nothing but noise. They packed in silence that could not be traced. Fog clung to the airstrip as the narrator watched Elena Ward trade a nod with Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross said, a helicopter can lift you at dawn if your data share remains fair. Sofia Rios traced the rotor schedule and found a gap where none should be. Sofia Rios said, your manifest hides an extra seat with no name attached. Ishan Kadir studied windsocks and kept his voice level. Ishan Kadir said, ghost passengers travel with heavy cargo. The tarmac smelled of jet fuel and wet dust, and every echo felt staged. Elena Ward said, we accept the lift, and we keep custody of originals. Daniel smiled as if the deal were harmless. Daniel Cross said, harmless is the cost of speed. The narrator felt the morning pull them toward a decision shaped by someone else. They lifted above the pampas, and the narrator watched the lines align like strings on a tuned instrument. Elena Ward said, vertices confirmed from altitude, deviations are deliberate. Sofia Rios photographed trapezoids that narrowed toward a new staging yard. Sofia Rios said, there is a fresh cut west of the Hummingbird. Daniel Cross pointed with a polite flourish that felt like direction. Daniel Cross said, our sponsor requested a brief detour for safety. Ishan Kadir leaned forward as if reading wind. Ishan Kadir said, safety is often a word for control. The pilot banked without call-out, and the cabin hush grew heavy. Elena Ward said, mark coordinates and hold original route after pass. The narrator felt the sky become a map of pressure and intent. They landed at a fence depot where crates wore stickers from vanished companies, and the narrator tasted metal in the wind. Elena Ward said, we inspect and leave, no exchanges. A foreman appeared with a clipboard and a fixed smile that did not reach his eyes. Foreman said, only a quick signature for transit records. Sofia Rios read the fine print and found a clause granting sample custody. Sofia Rios said, this signature moves our data into private inventory. Daniel Cross laughed softly as if the trap were friendly. Daniel Cross said, paperwork only protects everyone. Ishan Kadir shifted, and the guards relaxed too quickly. Ishan Kadir said, we depart now, and we sign nothing. The narrator counted cameras that watched and learned. Back at Kahawachi, the narrator watched Elena Ward align translucent overlays under afternoon light. Elena Ward said the detour matches Vale's donor grid, not safety. Sofia Rios layered drone stills and revealed tracks veering to a sealed sinkhole. Sofia Rios said, they harvest soil where the figure narrows like a throat. Daniel Cross offered coffee and a timeline that bent toward delay. Daniel Cross said, permit audits require a patient hour or two. Ishan Kadir stepped outside and dialed a contact who answered with silence. Ishan Kadir said, Val's people own the hour. Sand hissed along the adobe and tension nested in every corner. Elena Ward said, we split teams and move before the hour arrives. The narrator felt trust thin to a wire. The sinkhole lay behind a fabric screen, and the narrator smelled damp earth where the desert should be dry. Elena Ward said, moisture means recent exposure or hidden channels. A cable descended into shadow, and a humming generator kept steady time. Sofia Rios said, they lowered equipment and hauled samples at night. Daniel Cross praised their initiative with a tone that asked for trust. Daniel Cross said, Share your readings, and we can protect the site. Ishan Kadir found a transmitter hidden under a tarp and snapped its battery free. Ishan Kadir said, "Protection starts with silence." Footsteps approached, and radios chirped with coded brevity. Elena Ward said, "We leave by the ridge and return with witnesses." The narrator felt the trap close, and a path open at once. The desert night held a weight that pressed thought into silence, and the narrator saw Elena Ward sketch spirals into her notebook with unbroken focus. Elena Ward said, "Obsession is a compass, but sometimes it only spins." Sophia Rios leaned back against the jeep, her eyes catching the pale fire of the moon. Sophia Rios said, "Spinning compasses led only to cliffs." Ishan Kadir studied a weathered monolith, marked with scratches too straight to be casual. Ishan Kadir said, "Someone else charted here, and they stopped before finishing." The wind carried grit across their boots like whispered urgings. Elena Ward said, "If they stopped, it was because they feared what finishing meant." The narrator mocked, her voice tighten, as if she spoke of herself as much as the ancients. A dog barked from a distant settlement, and then fell silent. At dawn the lines burned gold, and the narrator watched Elena Ward pace vertices with measured strides. Elena Ward said these alignments fall not random but into an equation of intent. Sophia Rios held a drone controller, her face lit by screen glow. Sophia Rios said, "The trapezoid flares open, pointing toward no settlement, only horizon." Ishan Kadir measured magnetic drift and frowned. Ishan Kadir said, "Compass pull suggests underground ore veins, but mapped ones end far from here." Elena Ward stopped, her shadow crossing the line. Elena Ward said, "Then the pull is not Earth, but something placed to act as anchor." The air carried a metallic tang that did not belong to soil. The narrator felt each step deepen their entanglement. They gathered by a canyon wall where petroglyphs glowed faint in angled light, and the narrator felt a hush drop over them. Elena Ward said, "This hand repeated patterns seen in the lines." Sophia Rios brushed sand away to reveal a spiral enclosing a figure. Sophia Rios said, "The spiral ends not open but sealed." Ishan Kadir traced worn grooves with steady hands. Ishan Kadir said, "Generations copied, but someone altered the last mark." Elena Ward looked into shadow as if searching memory. Elena Ward said, "The figure resembles a catalyst more than a guide." A cracked voice came from behind, belonging to an older man whose eyes held sorrow. Miguel Alvarez said, "The spiral swallowed my brother, and no one returned." The narrator marked the canyon itself lean closer, as though listening. That night, the wind carried dust like a veil across the camp, and the narrator felt unease settle as a figure approached unseen until lantern light caught him. Elias Navarro said, "Patterns do not guide you, they test you." Elena Ward said, "Tests imply pass or fail, and failure leaves graves." Elias Navarro smiled faintly, his eyes dark pools. Elias Navarro said, "Graves hold more truth than maps." Sophia Rios stiffened, her hand tightening on her camera. Sophia Rios said, "Truth without context is poison." Ishan Kadir stepped forward, but Elias raised a hand. Elias Navarro said, "Do not ask me why I tell you. Ask why I was told to tell you." The narrator marked the lantern flicker as if shadows answered. The next day the narrator followed as they trekked to a ridge where markers had been deliberately shifted. Elena Ward said, "These stones were moved to mislead by one who knew the original grid." Sophia Rios photographed displacements with methodical care. Sophia Rios said, "The angles no longer converge. They scatter like broken compass arms." Ishan Kadir crouched and held a stone, noting fresh scrape marks. Ishan Kadir said, "Moved within weeks, not centuries." Elias Navarro watched from behind with a detached calm. Elias Navarro said, "Disruption is the easiest way to bury a truth alive." Elena Ward fixed him with steady eyes. Elena Ward said, "Then we unbury stone by stone." The narrator felt the ridge itself tremble in the dry wind. The ridge shook with tension, not from earth, but from silence, and the narrator saw Elena Ward brace herself as if against a tide. Elena Ward said, "Every map we built now bends under betrayal." Sophia Rios spread photographs across the Jeep hood, each showing altered markers. Sophia Rios said, "Someone worked beside us and erased while we recorded." Ishan Kadir ground his heel into dust as though stamping out deceit. "Ishan Kadir," said the hand that hides will soon overreach. Elias Navarro leaned on the rail with quiet detachment. Elias Navarro said, "Trust untested is illusion, and illusions break loudest." The air carried the sting of iron, and the narrator noted how the desert felt complicit. Elena Ward said, "Betrayal sharpens us. It does not end us." At dusk, the courtyard filled with shadows, and the narrator marked the arrival of Marcus Vale himself. Marcus Vale said, "Knowledge without control collapses into chaos." Elena Ward stood straight, refusing retreat. Elena Ward said, "Control collapses when truth surfaces." His gaze lingered, a polished mirror that reflected menace. Sophia Rios whispered near Elena, her voice clipped. Sophia Rios said, "His presence explains the silence in the records." Ishan Kadir's jaw tightened like steel. Ishan Kadir said, "Sponsors always arrive when damage is done." Marcus Vale smiled without warmth. Marcus Vale said, "Damage is perspective, survival is mine." The narrator felt betrayal tighten like a coil between history and present. The narrator followed as Sophia Rios unlocked a field crate under lantern light, her fingers shaking but precise. Sophia Rios said, "If truth survives, it survives in duplicates." Elena Ward nodded, her face lit like carved stone. Elena Ward said, "Then we carry what cannot be erased." Ishan Kadir readied a decoy binder filled with false coordinates. Ishan Kadir said, "We bait the trap and we watch who bites first." Elias Navarro studied them with eyes unreadable, silence his contribution. The wind bent flames sideways, and paper shadows stretched long. The narrator felt resolve harden in fragile light. The helicopter shadow crossed the geoglyphs as the narrator felt time strain. Elena Ward said they look for symbols turned to paths. Sophia Rios monitored a screen where the trapezoid flared into a corridor. Sophia Rios said, "The pattern funnels toward the horizon, no dwellings, only sky." Ishan Kadir's compass needle twitched and stilled unnaturally. Ishan Kadir said, "Magnetism is manipulated." Marcus Vale spoke through the headset, smooth and sharp. Marcus Vale said, "Every sign points upward, and upward is mine to hold." Elena Ward pressed the recorder. Elena Ward said, "Then every word you speak becomes evidence." The narrator felt the desert itself vibrate, as if holding breath. Night fell, and the narrator traced fear in every corner of the abandoned observatory where they gathered. Elena Ward said, "Truth stands taller than walls built to cage it." Sophia Rios stacked evidence drives into a steel case. Sophia Rios said, "If we vanish, these will speak." Ishan Kadir secured the locks and set a timed flare. Ishan Kadir said, "The flare calls allies faster than signals jammed." Elias Navarro lingered near the shattered dome, his silhouette fractured by moonlight. Elias Navarro said, "Moonlight shows what sunlight hides." Outside, engines hummed closer, and Marcus Vale's reach darkened the horizon. Elena Ward said, "Then, we are the horizon they cannot erase." The narrator felt resolve stiffen like stone against the night. Dawn thinned the night into paper, and the narrator watched Elena Ward stand at the ridge where the lines converged like veins. Elena Ward said, "I drew maps to outpace grief, and grief redrew me." The wind picked up the confession and laid it flat across the plain. Sophia Rios checked the recorder, her eyes steady and kind without surrender. Sophia Rios said, "Maps can heal if we stop using them as armor." Ishan Kadir unfolded a photo of a crater hidden by tarps and narrowed his gaze. Ishan Kadir said, "They mined the throat of the hummingbird and fed the silence." A distant engine coughed, then swallowed its noise as if warned. Elena Ward said, "If I chased echoes, I am done with echoes." She traced a new route that avoided every trap Daniel Cross drew. The narrator felt a hinge turn inside the day, and the door behind them click shut. They met Miguel Alvarez by a dry riverbed where reeds rattled like bones, and the narrator felt history breathe. Miguel Alvarez said, "My brother followed the spiral under the hill and never returned." Elena Ward set a palm on the old map, reading its scars. Elena Ward said, "The spiral is a funnel, and a shaft waits at its center." Sofia Rios pulled a fiber scope from a padded case and tested the lamp. Sofia Rios said, "We can see 10 meters if the bend is kind." Ishan Kadir anchored a tripod over a fresh sink in the silt. Ishan Kadir said, "Rope first, questions after." The lamp spilled down and caught on wood, shaved smooth by time. Elena Ward said, "He was here, and he chose to mark restraint." The narrator felt the riverbed hold its breath for the answer. At the municipal morgue, cool air smelled of antiseptic and dust, and the narrator braced for small truths with large teeth. A clerk slid a box across the counter and looked away. Clerk said, "Recovered 2 winters ago, no claim, no press." Elena Ward opened the lid and found a bundle of carved wood wrapped in cloth. Elena Ward said, "This is a message, not a relic." Sofia Rios matched the carving to a glyph hidden near the hummingbird's beak. Sofia Rios said, "The mark means keep out or mourn later." Ishan Kadir studied the tag numbers and circled a donor code that tasted familiar. Ishan Kadir said, "Vile's foundation processed this and lost it on purpose." Miguel Alvarez folded, then steadied like a tree that learned wind. Miguel Alvarez said, "He tried to warn, and they priced the warning." The narrator felt the room grow narrower with each matched line. Elias Navarro waited in the museum's sublevel where lights hummed like bees, and the narrator tasted the metallic edge of withheld truth. Elias Navarro said, "I fed you crumbs so you would pass the dogs at the gate." Elena Ward fixed him with a look that signed a reckoning. Elena Ward said, "Who holds your leash? And what did they buy with our time?" He smiled, then let it die. Elias Navarro said they bought delay, and delay lets soil go missing. Sofia Rios raised her camera and recorded without mercy. Sofia Rios said names, dates, routes, no riddles. Ishan Kadir blocked the door with a quiet shoulder and waited. Ishan Kadir said, "Confession travels faster when exits are scarce." Elias handed a keycard and a route map that smelled of ink still wet. Elias Navarro said, "Veil at the airstrip, midnight with export papers signed." The narrator felt motive shed its mask and stare back. Night draped the airstrip in tar and mercury, and the narrator followed shadows that carried contracts inside briefcases. Marcus Vale stood by a cargo ramp and wore confidence like a cologne. Marcus Vale said, "You have found what I cannot own, so I will move what I can." Elena Ward stepped into the spill of a sodium lamp and did not blink. Elena Ward said, "Evidence moves faster when broadcast by witnesses." Sofia Rios transmitted files to mirrored drives and watched confirmation stack. Sofia Rios said, "Now the sky keeps copies." Ishan Kadir lifted a flare and brightened a tarmac into truth. Ishan Kadir said, "Eyes inbound, signatures outbound." Engines spun as if nerves had gears. Marcus Vale said, "You mistake attention for power." Elena Ward said, "Power hates attention." The narrator felt the night change sides. The night throbbed with rotor wash, and the narrator watched Elena Ward step into the glare as Marcus Vale raised a hand like a seal on a document. Marcus Vale said, "Law is a game played by those who can afford penalties." Sofia Rios held the uplink steady and did not flinch. Sofia Rios said, "Public eyes are not a fee you can pay away." Ishan Kadir advanced with measured calm as ground lights ticked in a marching line. Ishan Kadir said, "Your exports end here, and your sponsors know it." A siren wailed from the perimeter, thin at first, then fuller, as if courage found volume. Marcus Vale said, "You believe noise equals consequence." Elena Ward said, "No, evidence equals consequence." The rotors slowed, and the narrator felt the field tilt from possession to accountability. Val's smile folded, and silence admitted defeat like a late signature. Dawn poured over the pampas like clarified light, and the narrator watched Elena Ward align the last overlay above the hummingbird's beak. Elena Ward said, "These are hydrology guides masked as devotion, not calls to the sky." Sophia Rios traced faint feeder channels that met at the wide trapezoids. Sophia Rios said, "Pilgrimage paths that teach water by walking it." Miguel Alvarez breathed out a sorrow that softened into pride. Miguel Alvarez said, "My brother read the spiral, and he read it right." Ishan Kadir nodded at cairns that matched star rise only as ceremony. "Ishan Kadir," said astronomy, "keeps time for labor, not for visitors." The wind skated grit across the chalked lines, and the truth held. Elena Ward said, "Messages for gods were lessons for people." The narrator felt the desert answer by returning silence as permission to understand. At the municipal hall, the narrator watched Daniel Cross stand before stacked crates now labeled as evidence. Daniel Cross said, "I routed you to delay the worst hands, not to serve them." Elena Ward kept her voice level, blade thin. Elena Ward said, "Delay still buries truth when it pays rent to power." Sophia Rios placed a recording on the desk, its timestamps clean and final. Sophia Rios said, "You authorized the detour to the sinkhole at Vale's request." Daniel looked down as if the floor might revise the past. Daniel Cross said, "I believed access could be bartered into protection." Ishan Kadir said, "Protection that requires lies is only custody for thieves." Papers rustled like dry grass, and the room chose its side. The narrator felt betrayal shrink into a smaller word called regret, useful but late. The museum courtyard filled with teachers and caretakers, and the narrator watched maps become lessons instead of leverage. Elena Ward said, "The lines survive when more feet learn them." Sophia Rios photographed new markers that favored learning over fences. Sophia Rios said, "We publish route guides that pair water with ritual." Ishan Kadir calibrated small ground beacons that blinked like patient stars. Ishan Kadir said, "Precision belongs to everyone, not to vaults." Miguel Alvarez held a booklet bearing his brother's name and did not hide his tears. Miguel Alvarez said, "He walked so the dry land could remember." A child traced a chalk spiral and laughed when it closed neat and kind. The narrator felt consequence transform into stewardship with a sound like doors opening. Evening stretched the desert thin, and the narrator stood with Elena Ward at the ridge where shadows completed what tools began. Elena Ward said, "Mystery is not the absence of answers, but the room they make." Sophia Rios closed the last case and set it down like a period after a long sentence. Sophia Rios said, "We will be read by those who need these lines to live." Ishan Kadir watched the first star appear and nodded once. Ishan Kadir said, "The sky keeps time and we keep care." The wind crossed the plain and gathered nothing it did not also return. Elena Ward said, "Let those who come after walk for water and find meaning on the way." The narrator felt the Nazca lines settle into themselves, finished yet still speaking, as night wrote its patient script across the earth.